Morning, folks. Good to see you. Just as everybody's joining, we've got a few more that need to join us before we can actually start. So we'll just wait a few more minutes. Whilst we're waiting, I'll just do a couple of introductions. My name's Kate Lowe. I'm the NWTN events team leader, and I'm joined by Catel, who will be my willing sidekick stroke assistant if necessary, if there's lots of questions going on in the chat. And of course, we are being joined by Rebecca, who will be leading today's session. We are delighted for her to join us on this. It's a very popular, proven to be a very popular event. Catel's just told me that we've got 60 people on the waiting list for this, so it sounds like you've been lucky to get your tickets. Just a couple of housekeeping issues. You are just all on mute for the moment until Rebecca needs any sort of interaction from you. It's absolutely fine if you don't want to have your video on, it's not essential. But there may be a point where you want to show your face when we do part of the session, which will involve breakout rooms. It's brilliant that you've all managed to join so far, so hopefully, fingers crossed, I won't do make any big errors with the technical side of it. Yeah, lovely to have you here. We've got, just to familiarise yourself with the bottom of the screen, in case any of you aren't aware, there is at the bottom a chat function. So if at any point you've got questions, if I could ask that you please type your question in the chat box, and when we've got an appropriate moment, we will, myself and Catel will flag up any questions that you have. If we feel that they've not already been addressed, we'll flag them up to Rebecca and then she can answer them at a suitable point. So if you could please use that as opposed to interrupting the actual presentation and discussion, that would be brilliant. There are reaction buttons on there in case you're wanting to wave at us or give us a thumbs up at any point. We've just got another person, just let another person in. What else? We will be having a break at about 11:20 for roughly 10 minutes or so, just to refresh your brains a little and stretch your legs before we carry on. I don't need to tell you about fire exits, that's good because we're all online. Yeah, so I'm not sure, Rebecca, do you want to start, or should we wait a couple more minutes just to see if our other people join us?
Maybe if we wait just till 5 past, 1 more minute, and then
no props. I'm sure I probably don't need to do much in the way of introduction for Rebecca. For those of you that may not be aware, Rebecca is a lecturer in interpreting and translation studies at the University of Manchester. She teaches theory and practice of translation and interpreting at both undergraduate and postgraduate levels, and does research into aspects of public service interpreting. She's particularly interested in the application of reflective practice to interpreter education. This is to foster independent learning and critical thinking skills. We are delighted that we can actually do this session because we've been waiting for a while to actually find out from you all what you would like as interpreters from the NWTN. It is quite difficult when I'm coming at it from a translator point of view. So we would welcome, if you haven't already completed and you are an NWTN member, we would be really grateful if you could take the time at some point this weekend to complete the survey that we've sent out to you. That's to inform us as to what we do in the next few months and perhaps the next year or so in terms of the events that we put on, because this is the first one that we're actually putting on that's a CPD classified event. We've had other social type events like coffee mornings and afternoons and quiz and a book chat. which some of you might have seen advertised on Twitter and Facebook. But yes, we would love to hear from you so that we can better meet our interpreter member needs as well as our translators. Rebecca, I think I'm now going to hand over to you so that I don't witter on too much more.
Thank you very much, Kate. Good morning, everybody. It's really lovely to see you all this morning. My thanks to the NWTN for convening this morning's event, and to Catel and Kate for all the administrative work in the background, and also for being the technical and moral support this morning. I'm sure a lot of you have attended various sort of Zoom meetings over the course of the last few months, and maybe even have done some classes, whether you've delivered them or participated in them. So bear with us if it feels a little bit clunky in relation to some of the transitions between activities. I think we're all still finding our way in this brave new world due to the pandemic. So thank you very much for giving your Saturday morning up and joining me. I'm sorry that we can't provide you with the refreshments and usual pre-event chit-chat and networking opportunities. I've got my water here. I hope you've got something as well there. And as Kate said, there will be a break as part of the morning's activities. So as Kate said, I work in Manchester, but I'm coming today from Halifax in West Yorkshire, where I'm based. And I frankly wouldn't be here today if I hadn't joined the NWTN back in about 1998. I think I've worked it out. And that was soon after I just completed my conference interpreting and translation training at the time at the University of Bradford. And then when I came to Manchester, and I can see some faces that I've known and learnt with as students, added public service interpreting skills to my portfolio. So today we'll bring together interpreters, I'm sure, of many different backgrounds, many different years of experience, those who today are using their skills, consecutive interpreting skills, very frequently. Others perhaps less so, others whose note-taking days may be quite far behind and they're keen to have a bit of a refresh. So I hope this morning that there'll be something for everyone. I think it's an opportunity at least just to have a bit of a pause in the hurly-burly of our working lives, to think about the mechanics of what we do, what works, what problems still tend to arise, even if you've been doing this for a long time. Why do you go to certain default settings when you hear certain sentence structures or certain ideas being presented? And, you know, just to start some critical thinking about how you might address those in an environment that is, you know, not audience facing. So I'm not going to be asking anybody today to perform in front of the group. We're going to do, of course, activities, and these will be small group only, and plenty of opportunity for chat, as Kate said, through the chat button, but also oral spoken interactions as well. But I think it's very important for me to stress at the outset that notes are only one part of consecutive interpreting, and we need to keep them in perspective. When you think about some of the problems that you might encounter and frustrations that you might encounter, of course, these can be due to comprehension issues, or probably more regularly sort of speech analysis issues. How are you, what we call parsing speech as it's coming through, breaking it down into chunks, distinguishing between primary and what might be called secondary information. So there's a whole range of things that I think we need to bear in mind about consecutive interpreting that's not just relating to notes, and that's something that I'd like to really get us to think about as we go this morning. So as Kate's just said, your microphones are muted for the time being. As we're quite a large group, and I hope you don't think me rude with this, I'm not going to propose that we all spend some time introducing ourselves, because I'd like us to get on with activities. But when you go into your breakout groups, please take a moment to say hello and introduce yourselves to your partner, and hopefully later on there'll be more space for people to talk a little bit more about their experiences and their backgrounds. But do use the chat. This is supposed to be a very democratic session, so it's not about me telling you this is how to do things. I will share some examples of my notes, but by no means are they supposed to be a model. They are just really a point of reference, so people can anchor discussions and thoughts about what they do compared to some of the things that I found useful. So please take them in that spirit. At the end of the session, I'm going to be forwarding everybody a copy of the slides that I'll be using this morning, although there aren't that many of them. And also I've created a small resource list for additional practice materials that you may find useful in the future. On that resource list, just to mention, the consultancy Interprite have a note-taking book. Some of you I know have already read it, but there is an offer through attending this session this morning to have it postage free. So this is a note-taking book, which is a huge repository of symbols that's particularly useful for public service interpreters, but also others. So there is information on the resource sheet about that. And I know Kirsty Hamel-Morgan is here this morning as well, and they'd like to say something about that later on as well. Okay, let me start the first task, which is to share my screen with you and see how we get on. Hopefully you can see it. Okay, can I see a thumbs up if you can see that screen on the front? Excellent. So here we are. Take note. And what I thought I'd do in this very first part of today is just to do a little bit of a recap and a refresh on some of the principles of note-taking that you were likely to have encountered in your initial interpreter training. So I'm aware, as I said before, that some of you may not have taken notes for a while, and so hopefully this will be a good foundation for what comes next this morning. So let's start thinking about some of these commonly taught approaches, and I've got my notepad here this morning. I'm sure you have. So the A5 notepad is very much a staple for the consecutive interpreter, and very often in interpreter training there is advice, particularly for long consecutive at least, to start off having a margin on the page. For European Romance languages, obviously putting on the left, but for other languages it may be on the right. And I think the point about this is just to reflect on some of these orthodoxies that emerge in interpreter training. So the left-hand margin was something that I was taught. We all used it religiously, but what I found quite quickly was I didn't put anything in the margin. I was squeezing everything right down the middle of the page. All this lovely space was not being used. So after a while I thought, well, I'm just going to ditch this and use the space. But as you'll see when I show some of my notes later on, that the left-hand margin, which is typically used for connectors and maybe some other pieces of key information, it is still very much there in my notes. But for me, visually, I didn't find it helped having this left-hand margin. So, you know, think about it. Is it helping you? Is it not? You know, you might not need it there. Of course, the language of notes is something that is not really prescribed on interpreting training programs. The emphasis is on people creating their own personal set of notes, and that means that they may vary their language choice depending on the circumstances of the text itself that you're dealing with, the speech material and other things. But I think some of the key points are on the slide there. So if you're note taking in that source language, of course, you are delaying the interpreting the language conversion process, which may be seen as the harder work. But if you're noting in the target language, of course, that cognitive burden is with you at the moment of note taking, which may in fact compromise your ability to really focus and listen on the speaker as you're doing it. So very often I think people end up doing this sort of mixed language approach. And that can be also due to some of the affordances of the languages that we know lending themselves to short forms, abbreviations, other than our mother tongue. So sometimes that's why we have this mix of languages. Of course, in PSI, dialogue interpreting, there can be a few risks involved, because sometimes if you're working for a very long period, you may momentarily forget which language direction you're working in. And I know that interpreters use all different sorts of tricks to note on their pad which direction they're moving in. So hopefully over the time that you've been practicing as an interpreter, you've experimented a little bit with this. And certainly this morning in the activities, please do feel free to do things that you've not done before. Use this time to experiment and see what sort of results you come out with. It's always nice to do that in a safe space of a CPD session, rather than trying to experiment when, of course, you've got your clients in front of you. Now, some of you may have seen these covers before. So these are two works, reference works, that have become quite legendary, I think, in interpreter training. But you can see they date back quite a way now, 1952 and 1956. And even if you've not heard of them, what I would argue is that probably your note-taking instruction in your initial training derived, at least in part, from some of the principles set out in these works. So these were interpreters who became very well known, and particularly in the context of the setup of the League of Nations and the United Nations, when long consecutive interpreting was the mode of interpreting used. I don't know whether this may come as a surprise if you're not familiar with the history of it, but it wasn't until the late 1960s in the United Nations when simultaneous interpreting started to be used. So consecutive was the mode, and it was very much embedded in these early training schools, for example, in Geneva and in Paris. So you can see that Rosin's techniques have been incredibly influential, particularly the 7 principles that you can see listed there. And I'm sure these are things that you may apply just intuitively, not necessarily realizing that they actually have a basis in the earlier history of consecutive interpreting. And of course, we see that first principle there maybe as the key one for interpreting, noting the idea and not the word. And this is really, I suppose, the idea that we shouldn't get sucked into the sentence level structure in our notes. We need to try and move away from it, and where possible, make notes of things in a way that is not language dependent, hence the idea of a concept rather than the word itself. But I think we need to think about this carefully. As you'll see later on with some of my examples of notes, I'm very word-based, and I don't mind saying that. I think that what happens sometimes where you are starting to learn interpreting, this idea of noting the idea relates to symbol formation, and there becomes very quickly an obsession with getting as many symbols as possible. Which can be counterproductive. And certainly that's what happened to me. So my initial training, I focused on getting as many symbols as I could. But what I realized after the end of my initial training was that effectively I was trying to use symbols to replace words, which is completely counterproductive. And I wasn't focusing enough on the main message. So that's why I think I stripped back my symbols use and went back much more to being word-based, but focusing all the while I was listening on synthesizing. So finding other words, finding other ways to express the essence of an idea. So this first point then is very much an orthodoxy in interpreter training, but we have to think about what does it lead to in terms of our own personal practice. But it's a good first point. So the others there, I'm not going to go into detail, as I say, because these are things that you'll be using very often. Abbreviations, of course, is a very key focus. So I'll just show you some examples of these from Rosin's work. A key feature that he proposes is to try to avoid ambiguity in notes as far as possible. So you could see on the second example there where you've got prod, and you abbreviate something to prod. When you come back to read your notes, of course, there is a chance that you will not recall what prod refers to. Is it producer, production, productivity? What is it? So by using the endings and the suffixes in superscript on the notes, that's often been a way, as promoted by Rosin initially, for interpreters to ensure that their notes are as ambiguity-free as possible. And you can see also there with the word specialized, if you just write spec, there is the same risk as with prod as well. And interpreters do create all different sorts of elaborate suffixes, not just sort of letters, and you may have come up with your own system over time. But I found that incredibly useful and taken that from Rosin's work. On the right-hand side of the screen there, you've got the emphasis on verticality, which again is probably something you intuitively do without necessarily looking at any textbooks on interpreting. So this is the idea that we work from top to bottom using the center of the page as opposed to writing right to left or left to right, depending on your language combination. And this is deemed very effective because the eye doesn't have to work as much when it's reading notes. And if you use plenty of space, then the concepts and the key ideas should jump out quite easily rather than being buried all in one part of the page. In terms of verticality, Rosin's technique emphasizes the advantages of what he calls stacking. And you can see an example there where you've got the R, the slash WEUR, so that would stand for report on West Europe. And I found that very, very useful, that idea of clustering things, so you can see the relationship between them on the page very easily. The final one, I mean, I won't go through links, negation, those are things I think, and emphasis, those are things I think people do automatically. But the final one relating to verticality is this last point of shift. And I've just got an example here from Rosin's book itself. So we can see the three lines that these notes represent there on the screen. So you've got 54 comma prices and an arrow upwards, representing the idea over the course of 1954, prices rose. Second line, although not to the same extent as income. And this use of the line is very much a Rosin technique. So it's sort of replacing information rather than recreating it. So when you look in your notes, you look at the information above that line, it should be a reminder of what it is referring to. And again, it's an incredibly useful time-saving device. And I use it not just for information, but sometimes for words that are very specific to a context, particularly polysyllabic words. Sometimes I try and create a symbol, but other times I might just have that word noted at the top of the page, and then I just use a line to replace that word as I'm going along and as it crops up on multiple occasions. That's something I very much benefited from in terms of Rosin's work. But over time, I'm sure you have developed your own workarounds and own symbols. There are some more recent contributions to note-taking that you may have heard of, so I've just put them on here. James Nolan, his work, Interpretation, Techniques and Exercises. So Nolan was a chief interpreter at the UN in New York, and Andrew Gillies, who's been based in the European Commission for a good number of years now, had a book on note-taking for consecutive interpreting, and both now are out in their second editions. I think a key point, if you've not looked at these works before, is that both authors, I think, are very conservative in terms of symbols. And I think that's a very good point to seize upon, because, as I say, sometimes there is a temptation to think that symbols are a really important goal in consecutive, rather than seeing them as part of this wider analytical process. and so there can be a tendency to over-focus on them. So those works there are out there on the market. Of course, those symbols do have a significant number of advantages, and I've just replicated some symbols here on the left that you may indeed use yourselves, or variations on those themes. These are very recognizable as interpreter symbols. Of course, what they allow us to do is to capture an idea perhaps quicker than writing a word. They can jump out of the page at us, so they've got this seizability that's useful. And as we've seen here on these examples, they're not usually language dependent. So that should minimize, if you like, the source text interference as you are listening to a source speech, and enable that formulation in the target language to happen a little bit more idiomatically and spontaneously, which of course is what we're looking for as interpreters. And also, again, used for frequently occurring contexts. Often, whether new or student interpreters ask questions like, how many symbols should I use? Where can I find new symbols? And I think a lot of interpreters would agree that these are not particularly helpful questions. There's no sort of should about it. It's very much using what works for you. And in a way, I think that is sufficiently flexible and adaptable. So that's one of the things that I learned to do, going from sort of being a student interpreter to being a practitioner, is trying to find ways to reduce the amount of symbols I was using, but make the ones that I liked work for me in multiple ways. So I think over time, my symbols became fewer, but much more flexible. And I just invented, obviously I shared ideas with other interpreters, but just developed my own system over time. Now, common problems. I don't know whether you can see yourself in any of these. Of course, time pressure. If the speaker is quite pacey, may mean that some of your notes are not easy to read, so illegibility can be an issue, difficult to resolve, of course. One that I've just mentioned, they're having too many symbols or lack of flexibility can also be a hindrance rather than a help. Something I do less of these days, but perhaps did a lot more in the past, was trying to invent a symbol on the spot and then going back and reading my notes and not remembering what the symbol was. And layout, so not leaving enough white paper, and what I'm calling insufficient bracketing off. So what I found was that I wasn't creating enough of a hierarchy in my notes between primary information and secondary information. So what we might call asides or supporting information. So you'll see now on some of the notes examples that I'll share with you this morning, quite a lot of physical brackets. That's what I mean by bracketing off in my notes. Forgetting connections between ideas. So even if you are quite good at using the left-hand side of your page or the margin for your howevers, your despite the fact that, to show contrast as you're going along, I think sometimes one of the problems in note reading is that we're looking too closely at a particular sentence just at that point on the page and forgetting the preceding information and its contextualization. So again, one thing to look out for in my notes is the use of arrows drawing ideas down, making links on the page rather than in the margin. And that's something over time that I found very useful. Ambiguity over agency. So this is this sense of who is doing what to whom. And this occurs in, I think, long and short consecutive. In public service interpreting, it can be particularly tricky if people are using reported speech. So he said this to me last night on the telephone, how are you noting down all those relationships? It's something that I used to typically omit, thinking I would remember it, and often I didn't. So that's something I've made a conscious effort to try and focus on in my notes over time. Another thing is being overly focused on looking at the notepad and not listening enough or looking at the speaker. And I'm calling this note blindness. And this also relates to something to do with symbols. Because I had so many at one point, I found myself and my eye really just focusing on me drawing a symbol and blocking out the actual content I was listening to. And I realized that over time, you know, that was not productive at all. So I think it's Claude Durand at the European Commission who always says, you know, when the going gets tough, when information becomes dense, put your pen down. And a lot of people, oh, I can't do that, but it's really, really good advice. So listening rather than working things out through note-taking. And of course, notes need to be adaptable. One of the things that we can never really predict, often in consecutive, is the speed, the acoustics in the room, the length, and abstract concepts maybe that come up, and of course uses of humour as well. So over time, I think our goal really is not to create a perfect set of notes. I don't think they exist, but they are to be as reliable as they can be. A few words then finally in this section then on note reading and performance. Sometimes I think when you're falling over your words, it's because you're not necessarily looking far enough in advance of what's coming up next in your notes, and this can sometimes lead to source language interference and a little bit of an infelicitous language in trying to formulate the idea, and also perhaps losing sight of the bigger picture. What was the thing about? What were the arguments in the main? So those are some things you may be reflecting on them because you recognize yourself in them. For others, you may have already resolved them quite happily in your professional practice. So I think really that's all I want to go over at the moment. I think one of the things that we really need to do is to get on with some note-taking and see how things are panning out. So I thought to start off with a I'll just stop screen sharing just for one moment. I will play you all a clip now, and it's about 5 minutes in length. It's a non-technical piece, and I'd just like you to take notes as you ordinarily would do as an interpreter. So say it's a non-technical piece. It's about the colour blue of all topics. So I don't know whether you want to abbreviate that or find a symbol for it in your mind already. So all being well, this will play. And I'll tell you afterwards what I'd like you to do. So I'm going to share my screen again. Here we go then.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Helen Campbell, formerly DG Interpretation of the European Commission. And today I'm going to talk to you about the colour blue. Now, if you visit me in my home in Brussels, you will certainly notice that I'm very fond of the colour blue. In fact, a friend of mine referred to my apartment as Le Château Bleu. The walls are in a subtle shade of blue-grey. The furnishings all have blue in them. The paintings on my wall are bound to feature blue somewhere. It is most assuredly my favourite colour. But it seems that I'm not the only person who favours blue. In quite a lot of surveys on people's preferences for colours, blue comes out on top. If people want to change the colour of their eyes, so buy contact lenses of a different colour, 60% of them will opt to take blue contact lenses. Research shows as well, interestingly, that blue does have a real effect on us, a unique and special effect. It has that effect as well on artists. Raoul Dufy, a French Fauvist painter, always said that blue was the only real true colour. Blue was the colour with strength of character. Blue always stays blue as well, in all tones, whether you're talking about sky blue, mid blue, royal blue, or dark blue. It's always blue. Compare that with the colour red. Very dark red turns brown. Paler red turns pink. Yellow blackens with age and fades in the light. But blue always is blue. Now, scientists have looked further at the implications of colour, and particularly the colour blue. What is special about it? its optical purity perhaps, or its complexity. And some researchers have been studying the history of blue pigments in human culture, the role that they have played, their significance, how they have affected our notions of virtue, of divinity, of authority, and even of social class, believe it or not. Blue pigment has always played a big role in human development, says a leading expert, a professor at the University of Zurich, who informs us that for some cultures, blue has been treated like gold. Well, for most researchers, and especially psychologists, the color blue evokes calm. It is a calming color altogether, compared with red, which is a color of action and aggression. If you look at a computer screen which is blue, you are likely to feel calmer than looking at any other color. And by the way, if you're preparing a PowerPoint presentation, I advise you to make sure you have a blue background. People will look more carefully at your presentation. They will also remember better what you present, and therefore that is altogether to be advised. But just a minute, we talk also about having the blues. So blue is clearly associated also with sadness. Where did that come from? Well, the answer is nobody actually knows. Some scientists have said that the color of the human body, when it is reduced, has a reduced flow of oxygen, turns a bluish shade. That might be a reason for this. Blue apparently suppresses the appetite as well. We avoid certain foods, for example, meat, if it has a bluish tinge to it, because it won't be fresh. The same applies to artichokes. If they have a slightly blue hue to them, they are not fresh, and so you should avoid them. One expert also pointed out that if you want to lose weight, you're on a diet, you should put a blue light bulb in your refrigerator, because the food will look very unappetizing and therefore you won't eat so much of it. That is just a little piece of advice. What about the actual creation of the color itself, the pigment? How is it created? Well, there are lots of chemical ways, of course, of producing different hues of blue. And there are some wonderful examples, much better examples, of blue in nature, in its natural form. For example, there is the blue produced by some species of crabs and also beetles. And some birds show wonderful plumage of blue. The blue jay, for instance, and the kingfisher are two very obvious examples. So blue is a color that attracts us. It isn't just a pretty color, though. As we can see, blue has a lot of different associations, psychological associations. And the use of the color blue, or its appearance in nature, seems to bear that out as well. So it may be that my attachment to the color blue is my wish, perhaps, to go back into nature. At any rate, if you do come to visit me, you are almost certainly going to note that there is in every corner of my apartment something blue. Thank you.
Okay, so we've just heard Helen Campbell's short statement there. What I'd like you to do now, you're all on mute. This is an individual exercise. I'd actually like you to put your notes to one side that you've just taken. And I'm going to give you 5 minutes. I'll put myself on mute, just for you to go through yourself as much as you can remember from that speech, just from your memory rather from your notes. You can do it in English if you like. If you want to use another language, that's absolutely fine. So I'll give you around 5 minutes just to recount, not looking at your papers, as much as you can remember in the order that it was presented. So over to you for 5 minutes. Okay. Hopefully that wasn't too traumatic a start to the session, but that's really to emphasize the point of the bigger picture. And it's a test that I would build into my practice. If I was ever concerned about getting too bogged down into the sort of sentence level structure and not thinking about the overall meaning or argumentation, I deprive myself of my notes and just really force myself to think, okay, well, what was the argument that was built? What was the information given? And that really readjusts, I suppose, that relationship between physical writing of notes and listening, and ensuring that you're looking up and listening to a speaker as you're going along. So if it's not something that you do regularly as part of your note-taking practice, then I would certainly recommend that you build it in. But let's look back at the notes now, and I'm going to put you into pairs. And what I'd like you to do, please, in your pairs is to work just in English and go through the speech with your notes and perform it. Do about half each, so you both have a go. And then I'd like you to spend 5 minutes or so just sort of talking a little bit about how you approach notes, generally speaking, how you approach them in that exercise, what you think was working well, and exchange a few ideas before we come back all together to talk about the activity. So I'm going to give you a good sort of 10 to 12 minutes for that in your breakout rooms, and then you'll get a warning. I think it's a 30-second warning that those will close, and it will automatically bring you back to the room where everybody is all together. So don't forget to unmute your microphones so that you can exchange with your partner. So Kate, would you be able to assign everybody, please, to a breakout room? So we'll reconvene here at about 11 o'clock. Everybody's back in the main room now. So hopefully you've had a chance to introduce yourselves to some fellow participants and have a chat about your approach to note-taking. What I want to do just briefly is to share my screen again and just show you some notes that I'd taken to that exercise. Again, not as any particular model of notes, but just as a point of comparison, and just to sort of talk you through some of the approaches that I've found useful over the years. So one of the things you'll probably recognise, first of all, is the dividing lines in between these different ideas, often of different lengths, and sometimes I think the length actually is reflects my thinking time. So sometimes I draw a long line without really realizing it, but I'm actually buying myself time as I'm thinking about it. I don't know if you can see my cursor on the screen, but towards the start there was a mention, wasn't there, of a friend sort of naming the flat, Le Chateau Bleu, and again, that's the sort of thing that I would put in brackets as a secondary piece of information, and making sure that was always to the right-hand side. A couple of other features I talked about before, perhaps missing out agency or agents, who is doing the talking and who is emphasizing a particular point. So I'm much more conscious about writing that down now. So on the left hand side of my screen, you can see a connector there like however, HR, but then you've got an RSS on this far left hand piece of paper, and that just stands for researchers. So I've got the agents there marked, so I know who is doing the action for that particular section. And I'm careful to write the surname of the artist, not necessarily the first name, which is always usually a tip given on initial interpreter training programs. So you can get at least the surname rather than the first name. So abbreviation blue, just a B here. For me, in the central column of notes, you can see here how I'm trying to make the most of the arrow as a time-saving device. So we've got the word pigment that I've written out in full there, and culture, but it's reused within that section. So I'm drawing the arrows down, so I'm not repeating the information, but I'm trying to make it clear that it's connected to the next pieces of information that go along. A couple of other sort of symbols that I use, you can see maybe the line from culture down towards a circle with a little, it's actually a hashtag and an S. So for me, the hashtag I use in relation to anything sort of numerical. So a hashtag M is sort of many, S here is some. So in relation to some cultures, which was emphasized there. And I'm trying, as you can see on this page, with calm, with the idea in this little circle with the head, it's that somebody going like that, shrugging, you know, why is this happening? And again, trying to draw that down and link it in. So on these pages, I haven't got an example of where I've drawn the line, as I would do with Rosan, but I'm using the arrows in a way that saves quite a lot of time and helps me think and process the information as it's going along. So whether or not these notes look anything like yours, or yours are much sparser, you found that it's much easier just to remember the information there. As I say, I write down quite a lot, I always have to, but I'm trying to use as much white paper as possible. I'll stop sharing my screen for a moment. As I say, you'll get a copy of this later on if you'd like to look at them in more detail. But I'd just like to open the floor to any questions or comments from that. I think, can you put a, there's usually a little hand feature, isn't there? We can put our hand up.
Yes, that's on the reactions button at the bottom.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so Martina, would you like to?
Marina.
Oh, Marina, sorry, Marina.
That's okay, yeah. I liked the exercise very much, and surprisingly, I forgot many things that I had tried to write. I didn't write the full phrase, but things that I thought that I would remember. But the color blue, I wrote the B every time that I had the blue. I got some of the information. I cannot say that I got maybe 6%, I would say. My colleagues, so maybe she can comment on that, how much she could how much she got from it, from me as well, you know. So, but I think it was very useful. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, shall we move on to another exercise then? Now we've sort of warmed up our pens and our minds. And so this one is also taken from the same context, and it is, oh, sorry.
Sorry, Rebecca, I think Sue had a question.
Oh, sorry, Sue, go ahead, yeah.
You can unmute yourself, Sue, if you want to ask a question.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to compliment my room partner, Marina, who's just spoken. She did really well, I thought. I just wanted to say I found the pace of the speech really, really good. And to be honest, interpreter friendly, but I think Helen Campbell is herself, or was, an interpreter from what I can remember. I didn't think the speech was really technical at all. It was mainly pretty easy terminology wise. I got a little bit foxed on, excuse the pun, on some of the names of birds, you know, kingfisher and just some little bits like that. But I think what I found probably the most difficult was the repetition of the word blue, because it was just coming at you all the time. And sometimes it was so frequent that I found myself missing bits. Blue this, what blue that, blue what else is blue? You know, it was quite difficult to be specific in my notes at some points, because it's quite rare, I think, to have a speech where you're getting one term, like, and whatever the term is, repeated to that degree. That for me, I have to say, was the most difficult part of that.
Yeah, I completely understand that, and I think it's one of the challenges always with consecutive, isn't it? You don't necessarily know where the speaker is going and to what extent, for example, blue would, I mean, we know it's a speech about blue, but to what extent it would frame absolutely every section. So you're constantly battling, I think, in your mind, do I write it down here, or do I just assume everything I'm saying here, it has this mention of blue in it? You can see on my notes, I just abbreviated it to B, and it was peppered all the way through. But I can see, you know, why you might decide not to put it in at one point and then think, oh, well, was this actually connecting to the colour or to something else? So I completely understand that as a tension point for that one there. Thank you for that comment. But you're right, let's put that speech in context. So it's very much a pedagogical speech that's been developed by a very experienced conference interpreter in the EU setting. It's a great one, like you say, for us to start off with because of the pace. It's nice and clear, very well structured, and so on and so forth. But we don't experience those sorts of speeches necessarily in every job. So before we break, let's put our notes to the test in a slightly different way. And I've selected a speech now that's very much from a real world context. So you've got a real pace and a real context. So it is within a European Union context. This speech is on the theme of something called CSR. You've probably heard of it, corporate social responsibility. Now, it's a concept that we hear a lot about in this day and age, but just to warn you, this speech is a couple of years old. So it was at a time where it was perhaps less known, but becoming known. So that will help you put some of the speaker's comments in context. It's about the same length as the speech you just heard from Helen Campbell, but as I say, it's very much reflecting the real world context. So see if some of your fail-safe note-taking mechanisms work this time round. So in this exercise, I'm going to play the clip. I'd like you to take notes, and then immediately we will go into our pairs or our three. And again, I'd like you just to split the speech in half to try and perform it as much as you can from the notes that you have. And again, I'll share afterwards some of my notes examples. Okay, so corporate social responsibility. So CSR is your abbreviation of the morning. So just bear with me as I set up. Okay, here it is.
Thank you very much, Monsieur Vignon. I will certainly endeavour to stick to the tight schedule to allow my colleagues as much time as possible to speak. About this time last year, The Economist had a special edition on CSR. I think they devoted 20 pages to the issue, and SME or small and medium-sized enterprise was mentioned once in the whole of that special edition, which I think reflects perhaps the slight anathema between the term CSR and, of course, the word corporate, and sometimes how it is perceived by stakeholders and indeed by small businesses themselves. It's not always something that they relate to naturally, but nonetheless, we've been involved in a number of projects with specifically the aim of trying to raise awareness of the concept and the importance of the concept among smaller businesses. And I'd like to highlight a couple of those projects to you now in the short time I have. The first one I'd like to refer to is a project that we called CESAR, which ran during 2006 and 2007, during which 48 of our chambers, we have a network of 2,000 regional and local chambers across 45 countries, but a small percentage of those, 48 chambers, had the opportunity to develop CSR training via experts and to give personalized CSR guidance to SMEs. This allowed us to establish a new network of experts to provide useful and tailored advice to several hundred SMEs from experienced advisors, and to develop a multiplier effect, which has progressed subsequently. And at the end of it, we produced a manual which has been used by many more chambers for their own CSR-related activities. The second European level project I'd like to refer to is the CASE project, which is an acronym meaning Chambers Towards Acquis Support and Business Ethics. And as the name suggests, this was aimed at countries that were in the process of joining or may soon be joining the European Union. notably Romania and Bulgaria at the time, and Croatia and Turkey. This wasn't exclusively about CSR, but it had a strong CSR element in that we introduced the CSR strategies into a number of very small and new businesses. This was via an information campaign, and approximately 100 companies were visited individually to explain to them the CSR concept and to integrate a CSR strategy into their activities. We also have a number of activities at regional and local and national level. The Belgian chambers have been involved in a project called Quadrant, which has been interesting in the sense that the chambers themselves have been developing a CSR strategy. So it's been something that they've, an exercise that chamber staff have gone through themselves, and that has helped them to translate this concept, to empathise with the small businesses that they're serving and that they're providing expertise to, and they found that a very valuable and rewarding experience. And our Italian chambers, Union Camere, have developed an extremely strong network of CSR centres with a mandate from the national government to do so. They've developed 61 CSR centres and provide a portal that is dedicated solely to raising awareness and disseminating CSR practices. Given the tight schedule, I'd just like to conclude with a few comments and recommendations, a few observations from those projects, and a few recommendations about where we need to go. The vast majority of small businesses do practice CSR, even if they don't necessarily realise it. The challenge sometimes is that it fluctuates according to the management in place within a business. Some business managers are very engaged in CSR, others less so. And to be able to maintain the momentum, there needs to be a coherent strategy, and that's really the key, we believe, to ensuring that CSR becomes a sustainable and inbuilt strategy for a number of SMEs. It can't just be a one shot. It needs to be something that is ongoing in terms of expertise and advice available. The personal contact of a CSR advisor has been very much appreciated by companies. That's something that we've learned, and it lays the foundations for stronger involvement and ongoing activities. I won't go through all of their lessons learned, but I'd be happy to provide them afterwards. Just a couple of very brief comments, perhaps following what Commissioner Spidler said about public procurement. The Commission claims that over 42% of European public contracts are awarded to SMEs. We're not totally convinced by that statistic, but nonetheless, a significant proportion of public contracts do go to SMEs. So I think it's very important that they reflect carefully on the link between CSR and public procurement, which the Commissioner referred to, and those new guidelines that they're working on. And my final point is that it's very clear from the projects that we've been involved in that SMEs are interested in CSR, even if they perhaps don't recognise it as a definable process or deliverable in the same way as we sitting in this sort of forum might. To most, it's really just good business sense to contribute to the community and the environment around them. And I believe this is as much the case in the current climate as ever. Thank you.
Okay. So, Kate, if you could please put everybody into a room. So this will be our last activity before we have a break. So as I say, work through the speech half and half, and spend some time sort of sharing ideas on the problem areas and what sort of solutions that you try to find while taking the notes. And we'll reconvene just before the break very briefly. Thank you. Okay, so welcome back everybody. So that was quite a different proposition in terms of speech, style, pace, content, density, lots of micro decisions to be made by the interpreter there. I think it also stresses the importance of regular practice. It's easy to build up, but then if you leave it a couple of months, one's ability to process information at those sorts of speed, I think, really does quickly diminish. And I think this is why it's fantastic in this day and age, through the internet, we've got access to these speech repositories where I took those two first examples from. And there are others, so they will be listed on the resource sheet, so you can do that sort of practice quite regularly, and in the different languages that you work with as well. So just before we go, so Deborah, you've got a question there. Is there a bank of speeches available for practice? Yes, absolutely. Different levels of difficulty as well. So that'll be on the resource sheet that we'll send out. Just as we go to the break, I thought I'd just make available my notes from that exercise again, just as a point of comparison. So hopefully they're popping up on your screen now. So there's 2 sheets this time and not 3. So hopefully you can kind of sort of start to get a feel for the sort of grammar of the notes that I typically take, certain features repeating, such as the arrow drawing down. And although that speech was quite information dense, I think there was a very clear structure. The 2 projects were mentioned, and then this sort of series of reflections and recommendations. But the speaker obviously was very conscious about time, and that's always an interpreter's nightmare, isn't it? Because you think if they're running out of time, they're going to speed up. And so having that flexibility in note taking, I think is very important. So, for example, on the second page towards the second half, you can maybe make out the word lessons, and in brackets, ask me. So this idea that people could go and ask for more information afterwards. But the same features I tried to include, so making an effort to note agents, countries. You can see an emphasis on names and numbers there, which regularly crop up. A couple of my symbols just to highlight on the first page. So in the sort of first half, you've got 2000 and then you've got 45. So my reference to 2000 there is a little symbol to network, 45 countries, which is another common one. And further down also we have networks as well. My arrow going into almost like a brick wall is the idea of an outcome and then a result, which is a very effective and comes up very, very commonly. The idea of having different levels within the European setting, regional, national, I think is quite a feature of this particular context. And you might just see down the bottom, it's a similar symbol on the left-hand side to network, but I've just got an R and an N to denote those different levels there. And that is quite a quick shorthand for denoting that. But I was really emphasizing, you know, the names of the projects, and trying not to repeat too many words. It's really less word based than the one I did for the Helen Campbell one, because I'm under that much more pressure. But hopefully you can see that I'm still trying to make an effort to order the information, so I've got certain aspects bracketed off if it's not the key point. So I think we've all earned ourselves a break now. I'll leave these notes on the screen while we have a break if you'd like to have a look at it. And of course, I'll forward you the link to those speeches so you can listen to them again in your own time. But when we come back from the break, I'll give the floor to you all to ask some questions and give some reflections about this last activity. But I'll sign off for the moment, and we'll reconvene just before or just after 11:45, so everybody can take a quick comfort break. So thank you for your attention in this first part. How would you say your note taking has changed since your training to what you're doing today?
Well, because I do mainly translation, I think probably I've forgotten a lot of the symbols that I used to use. So it's probably more word-based. But other than that, I'm actually surprised by how much I've probably remembered from my initial training. I had the impression I'd forgotten everything, but actually looking at what I've done, I think, and comparing them to your notes, I think I've actually remembered a bit more than I thought.
That's good. I think it's just keeping the eye in and the hand in practice. I think that, you know, over a short period of time, you can actually build up your confidence quite quickly, but you can also be lulled into a false sense of security that if you don't practice then for 3 or 4 months, that when it comes to the pressure, that you're slower than you think. So I think practice is part of it, even if you're not using it professionally, just trying to keep it going a little bit and often.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Roz. Anybody else like to comment on the type of notes they took, you know, under that pressure? Were there things that you really tried to focus on, like the topic change, like I've just signaled, or? What were the areas of omission, for example?
I think the problem for me was that I predominantly do public service interpreting, where I've seen there's only maybe a handful of, well, maybe not a handful, but maybe 20, 30, you know, concepts that you operate with all the time. And my type of work doesn't really demand long consecutive very often. We mostly work with short consecutive or simultaneous, and that's really it. You know, so for me, you know, it was kind of a question of, first of all, kind of that mental resilience, because A, you know, it's a difficult, unfamiliar subject, and B, the sense of urgency was conveyed by the speaker himself, who was going, "Oh, I need to fit it all in." I think that's kind of that is a little bit contagious, and I certainly have that impression, for example, with barristers very often, who, you know, have to fit in everything, you know, in a very small, you know, chunk of time, which, you know, for us interpreters sometimes is just well and impossible to, you know, to work with. That's one thing, but also I think, you know, for me, the main thing is the familiarity with the subject, because obviously I don't know what work of a EU, you know, interpreter looks like, but I'm guessing they probably have that, you know, fingertip familiarity with a lot of concepts and processes and the way things work, just like I would, you know, have with the whole criminal and civil, well, the criminal and civil process that I, you know, come across with. And I think that's probably the big one, because if it's like an unfamiliar territory, you know, you start blundering and you know, you have that panic response, whereas if it's something that you know very well, you know, the fact that I might have forgotten to finish a thought or a section is not that much of a big deal, because I can go back to it and then remember. Whereas here, I basically just had clusters of semi-formed thoughts, lots of shortcuts, lots of numbers, but together they were, I can actually show you, they were quite disjointed, because I didn't have that sense of this is where it's going. I kind of halfway realized that it's semi-list, semi-discussion, but because I don't really know how this works, it was not really successful. That's kind of my impression.
Thank you very much. That's a really interesting set of reflections, and I think you're absolutely right to highlight those distinctions between the short consecutive in PSI and the longer consecutive used in conference environments or business meetings. They're very, very different, as we'll find now as we'll move back on to PSI for the final part of today's session. I think it can be, like you say, very beneficial if you are a staff interpreter, you're used to the context and you'll have the institutional memory. So you'll have a sense of when CSR was first sort of mooted in that forum, the sort of discussions that have been held about it. So cognitively, you don't have to put as much effort into trying absorbing the new information. However, for many conference interpreters, they are going in and out of different fields and building, especially at the start of their career when they're building familiarity. And those first, you know, parts of a day in a new environment are incredibly taxing. But I think that most interpreters find that they sort of relax after the first sort of part of the day when certain concepts are repeated. A meeting is usually around a particular theme. And of course, you have the opportunity often to ask delegates about certain things in that conference environment, and to build up the knowledge that way. But it is incredibly difficult in those first instances to try and absorb the new information. So asking for as much pre-information, presentations and ideas is hugely important. But the impact, as you just highlighted on your notes, that clustering, you've got a number there, a number there, how does it all relate together? I think is a very key difference between PSI type of interpreting and longer consecutive, because in PSI you have a number, you have a date, you're very likely to remember the context around it in that short term, whereas here we're having to wait 4 or 5 minutes before we start interpreting, and so having that cluster within an anchor somehow, whether it's an arrow or an agent positioned at the start of that section, is something that just has to be worked on, I think, over time. What I realized, I think, was over time was that note-taking is much more elastic than you think it is. So that's where, you know, I talk about forcing myself to start a new point as soon as I heard it, because oftentimes you can use the pauses or the repetitions that a speaker makes to go back and infill certain sections that you didn't have time to write. And I think you become much more aware of those pauses and listening out for them. Listening to that particular speech first off, you probably thought, oh, there wasn't much redundancy, and there wasn't, but he fluffed his lines a little bit, particularly at the start. I don't know if you noticed when you were listening, he used the word anathema in a way which was completely incorrect and sort of bumbled his way around it. And so I was listening to that thinking, well, I can kind of see a point emerging here, but I waited. I made sure I waited and didn't try and get bogged down in that use of anathema or why.
Oh, yes.
And to synthesize it. So I suppose that's another sort of reassuring thing about speakers, especially when they're speaking spontaneously. There is likely to be more repetition than you actually maybe have the impression while you're taking those notes. So listening out for those pauses is something you can try and build in to your practice. Very good points there. Thank you very much. Anybody like to make one last point? Kezia, yes?
Kasha, yeah. Hi, Rebecca. Thank you very much. I'm also a PSI interpreter. So I've never been taught long consecs, so this is very useful and very interesting. My question is that in PSI things tend to be shorter, but sometimes you end up with longer pieces, but you don't necessarily know that at the beginning. So it's a general question, is there any difference in the approach to note taking between the two? So if you start off and you don't know what's coming, or if you do know what's coming, do you take a different approach, or do you always take a similar approach for both scenarios?
I would personally take a similar approach to both scenarios, even though I know I'm writing things down that are maybe sort of redundant, or I know that I'll be able to retrieve them very easily. And one of the reasons for doing that is because a lot of PSI sessions can go on for many hours. So having sort of some sort of note about what's going on as it's going on, you can flick back through in those pause moments and pick up certain ideas again. So I found it beneficial from that perspective. I tend to write probably more than I need to. That can be just a part of a nerve management strategy as well as anything else. But I also find it helpful for thinking through how I might phrase an idea then when I'm working into the next language. So I do tend to adopt a very similar approach to the two. However, as we'll see now, as we move on to PSI, I think it lends itself very often to much more sort of pictorial forms and descriptions, because people are often seeking advice or explaining something that's happened to them, and it could be in the medical, of course, field, or in a criminal sort of sense. These stories and narratives do lend themselves perhaps to a slightly different style of note taking. So I think that's a very good point at which to segue into our final part for today. So thank you very much for those questions. So I'd like to share with you, if I can, just one brief set of slides to kick us off for this final section here. Okay, hopefully everybody can see this now. So some of the things that are on this slide that hopefully you can see have just been touched upon by some of the participants. What is it about short consecutive, typically used in PSI, but also a lot of sort of more intimate business interpreting type meetings, that makes it different to the long consecutive, apart from time and pressure? So I've made a tentative list here of what I would call these distinguishing features. So very often for long consecutive, you're probably working at least from notes or a prepared script, the speaker that is. You've got the advantage of hearing everything unfold before you interpret, which is seldom the case in PSI, when it can be much more fragmented. And people make different decisions. I was just talking with Kate before about her experience at the Home Office, and making a very conscious decision to give a small amount of information and then wait for the interpretation. But of course, different speakers don't have that sort of sensibility or level of awareness of how that might help or not help the interpreter. So the result can be highly fragmented discourse that you're taking notes to. So in long consecutive, because you have the argument, you might sort of not be sure about something you've heard at the start, but if a speaker makes a similar point later on or reframes the same point, your comprehension issue might be clarified. Whereas in PSI, short consecutive, you might actually have to intervene and say, can you repeat that or re-express it to have that intervention. It's not always the case, but I think in long consecutive, we should find more signposting to key ideas and topic changes according to such and such. I'm now going to turn to this, or just to end, I'm going to do this, where those sorts of markers are much less present, of course, in more short-term conversational interactions. Register can also be an interesting one. I've not really found a need to really make that present in notes in any particular way, but being aware of it as you're listening so you don't change or alter the register in a way that misrepresents a client or service user. And of course, the key point is that the note-taking among conferences is just sort of seen typically as a very normal part of the interpreter's work, whereas note-taking in many public service settings can be viewed with a great deal of suspicion. As we can understand, we're a front row seat at people's most intimate moments and can be quite distressing. And so I think a lot of interpreters would make it clear as to why they're taking notes, and often destroy them in front of all participants before everybody leaves the room. So we've got idea fragmentation, greater use of reported speech, I think, in public service interpreting, which I think is a challenge in note-taking terms. Sometimes, depending on the setting, there might be a lack of coherence on the part of the original speaker. So I'm thinking in particular of asylum contexts where somebody has got that opportunity to tell their story and it comes flooding out, but not necessarily in any sort of logical order. And so that's an additional challenge for interpreters to know whether to try and impose some logic or intervene more to stop and ask for clarification at that moment. And accompanying non-verbal gestures in PSI, I think, is very much goes hand in hand with the note-taking process. So I talked in long consecutive about the importance of looking up, looking at the speaker, but in PSI I think that becomes really paramount, because as people probably know, you can interpret something correctly, but because it refers to quite dense bureaucratic administrative language, you will have a sense as to whether the service user has understood the correct term, or if not, they might glaze over. So looking at how meaning is created between the non-verbal communication can be a way of embedding an idea into the short-term memory, and in fact meaning that you don't necessarily need to take any notes. So non-verbal gestures, I think, are hugely important. So some questions then that come up, I think, for PSIs in short consecutive mode: do I need to take any notes at all? And one of the things that's happened recently, through my work at the university and speaking to different organisations in Manchester about their work with interpreters, is that very often they will say, my PSIs that I work with don't take any notes at all. And that's probably quite indicative of the training landscape in and around Manchester. So not all people have been trained in notes. But what is interesting in some of the experimental work I've done with some service providers in the last year or so, they have noticed a huge difference with interpreters who do more consistently take notes. They've got much more confidence in them. They get a sense that the level of detail is much greater. So I'm trying to encourage confidence in the way they maybe encourage interpreters to take notes on site. Another question that comes up is the use of symbols. Again, can be useful, but because PSIs typically take fewer notes, as has been highlighted by one participant, I wouldn't recommend any sort of obsession about symbols creation. You may find if you do a mixture of long consecutive and short consecutive, you can import some of your symbols use into short consecutive, and I think that's trial and error, and that's perfectly fine. But one of the key issues that, again, was touched upon earlier by the participant is this sense of, well, how much do I let a person speak? What is the length? Should I allow somebody to give a longer narrative than I may do in other circumstances? And I'm very much in favour of note-taking supporting a service user to tell their story, i.e. to talk for quite a length of time without me compromising the level of detail. Just because in PSI, working with people who have experienced a lot of trauma and don't necessarily have a lot of opportunity to speak and give their experience, and I think that to try and break that up into two shorter components can be disturbing and quite distressing in some circumstances. So I think that good note taking should be able to support this longer narrative, and I think that's what I'd like to really focus on in our last sort of couple of moments today. So I'll just, sorry, I don't know what I've done. Okay. Okay, yes, that's what I'll do. I'll stop that now. Excellent. All right, so let's think about that first question then. Should I take notes? Do I need to take notes? I think it's, at the end of the day, it's quite an intuitive process. But let's just do a few exercises now just to get a feel for the sort of things that you might note down. So this is going to be just an individual exercise. Again, your microphones are on mute, so you're just talking to yourself or the room. And I'm going to read out a series of statements, if you like, or questions relating to healthcare interpreting. And at the end of each, I'm going to pause, and I'd like to encourage you to interpret that into your respective languages, but for you to decide how much or whether you take any notes at all for that particular statement, and just see how you go as I go through. So I'm going to read out 6 in total. Okay, so here we go. These should be quite familiar questions if you work in PSI. So the first one is, do you have a family history of blood pressure? How much physical exercise do you do in an average week? Have you had any nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, or constipation? When you put your full weight on your left leg, how does that feel? This medicine has some side effects, so don't take it on an empty stomach, always with food. You may also experience dizziness and palpitations, and we will monitor your blood glucose levels regularly over the next 4 weeks. Final one. Before we take you down for surgery, we need to go through a few administrative things. It says on this form that you have a shellfish allergy, so I'll need to give you a red wristband. Okay, well done. Those are the end of that first one there. This next one is a longer statement by a patient describing their condition. This is going to relate to a lung problem. And while you're thinking about this and perhaps taking some notes, I think really consider the way in which either symbols or pictures might help to tell the story a little bit more efficiently than words. So I think it lends itself to that. So I'm going to read it out now. And again, at the end of it, I'll give you a few moments to give an interpretation of that content. Here we go. Let me explain, Doctor, how it all began. I had a pain in my right side. It was a really excruciating pain. It made me tired and weak, and I just wanted to sleep all of the time. I couldn't walk, sit, or lie. And when I started to get a shortness of breath, that's when I decided to go and see my GP. I was taken for a CT scan that revealed fluid on my lungs. I couldn't understand why I'd got fluid there because I'd been taking diuretics for the past 6 weeks. So they drained the lung, and then they took me for a blood test and a chest x-ray just to check that everything had been drained. Over to interpret. Okay, Kate, if I could ask you to put people into breakout rooms again. And all I'd like you to do, please, is just compare notes on those last activities, in particular, your approach to that final activity. Was there anything that you tried out that was different? If you're not used to using pictures, did you find that they worked to help you recall that information in that instance? So just a couple of minutes and I'll bring everybody back together again for another exercise. So hopefully you can see a few symbols on the screen in front of you. So that's just an example of notes taken to that last paragraph there. So far fewer notes taken, as I'm sure has been the case for most of you. And I've tried to really use more sort of emoticons, which I find really, really helpful in PSI. So there's a lot more emphasis on the actions and the consequences, processes, but also emotional matters. So that's my sort of sad face there, my sleepy face there, and then the reference to lungs after CT towards the bottom. So trying to combine the pictorial elements and this idea of draining and being full, that can be denoted with arrows quite quickly. So I'm hoping that these notes sort of mirror yours to quite a considerable extent, because as you've all pointed out, and I found, you tend to write a lot less in these sorts of circumstances. I'd like us just to do 2 more short exercises if I can this morning. So the next one is also on a medical related theme. And this is about treating kidney stones. So this sense then of movement of kidney stones will hopefully get you thinking about how can you depict that on the page in an efficient way, because to write out to pass a kidney stone will take up quite a lot of time. So this is a very short statement by a healthcare practitioner about the treatment for kidney stones. So I'll stop sharing this screen for now. Here we go. There are 2 ways that we can treat kidney stones. One is simply to wait, and our GP surgery would check in with you in about 1 week's time. And in the meantime, you can be given medication to relax the urethra and see if the stone passes. And you'd have this medication for 1 week, but it would be possible to give you 2 more weeks' worth if needed. Surgery is also an option if the stone isn't passed. Usually we can do surgery within 3 to 4 weeks, but at the moment all elective surgery is on hold. So you'd have to go on a waiting list and wait to be called. But I'm hopeful though that surgery will not be needed in this case. Over to you to interpret. Okay, and one final one now from a slightly different setting. So this is to do with a narrative of a witness of an assault in a park. So we're in a police setting now. And again, I think it's difficult, isn't it, because of the need for the interpretation to be part of that evidence in a case, and the need for accuracy, to be concerned with the length of utterance, because you don't want to miss anything out. But equally, if you have a victim of an assault in front of you and they're keen to get their story out in the best way that they can, I think too many interruptions can prevent that flow and can sometimes be emotionally quite difficult for the victim. So it's quite tricky. But again, I think that these techniques of thinking about movement, action, in particular over the words, can ensure quite an accurate narrative as you move through the context. So let's give this one a go. So as I say, it's about an assault in a park. So the witness says, "We went to the co-op to buy some cigarettes. It would have been around 5:30 in the evening. We were walking back towards my house when he gripped my arm and walked me, or marched me, to the park. His grip was really tight. I've got bruises around the elbow. He started shouting at me, saying all these things, that I'd been a bad mother, that I'd been unfaithful while he'd been in prison. And that wasn't true. It just simply wasn't true. My sister will tell you. She'll tell you that I'm telling you the truth." Well, we got in the park and he pushed me onto the park bench, and there was nobody around, and he told me that I wouldn't be leaving the park alive. And he lit a cigarette and just kept punching me in the arm and the leg. And then finally he punched me so hard that I fell on the floor, and my eye was bleeding heavily. And after that, I blacked out and I have no more memory of what happened. Okay, over to you for one final interpretation. Okay, so I'm just going to share two screenshots with you of my notes from those last two exercises. So this first one is about the kidney stone. And again, I'm just sort of highlighting this because of the structure of that first piece, the two options there denoted on the page. My idea for the stone passing can be seen with the two sort of tram lines and the little circle in the middle with the arrow. So that was the sort of solution I found in the heat of the moment to try and denote that sense of movement. For surgery, which is quite a long word to write, I've just got the scalpel knife as my symbol there, but very few words I think were required. Just to draw your attention to the bottom though here, again, I've got my focus on agency because the doctor said, I'm hopeful that surgery won't be needed. And my use here of the tick with a H as a sign for hope, again, is a very flexible symbol for me. So the tick can denote so many things like achievement, success. And if I need to remember exactly which it is, I would maybe just put the letter as I have there for hope at the end. But I found that over time, that's also been very useful in these sorts of environments as well. And stressing emotion, because I think in public service interpreting more than in the long consecutive, the emotional aspects of the note taking, you know, and getting a sense of, you know, that excruciating pain. It's more than just emphasis. I think there's quite a lot of nuances there that need to come out and be retained in some shape or form. Often it's the non-verbal cues that will help you retain that extra information, but sometimes if the narrative is quite long, then there may be a need to note it down on the paper. The final one then here is just my notes to the park one that you've just done there. And as you can see, I'm trying to use pictorial forms to save time. So my brackets there, it's supposed to be an elbow with bruises on it. The idea of speaking, which is here, he started shouting at me. So I use a speech mark for say, tell, describe. It's a very flexible symbol, but with the sort of sunshine rays out, again, it's that sort of emphasis of anger. So I'm trying to capture that very, very quickly. And then we've got kicking and punching symbols down there on the left as well. So I think it's quite a lot in those that lend themselves to the pictorial form over words that certainly couldn't be used in long consecutive. So I think there is quite a distinction between the two. I'm going to open the floor now to everybody just to add some final reflections on your approach to these notes compared to the long consecutive, and what you found easier or what you find more difficult. If anybody would like to unmute and chip in with a comment. Yes, Sasha?
Yeah, I'm not convinced that PSI is more sort of suitable for pictorial, because to me, if a doctor wants to hear what a patient's saying, they want to hear those exact list of symptoms. Mm-hmm. And I actually think the precision is far more important in those scenarios than it is in the with the man talking about corporate social responsibility, because his words are effectively generalities and you're trying to get the general gist. Whereas with the symptoms and things, you have to be very precise. So I actually would say that I would focus more on words here and make sure I get the exact. I don't have to put the stuff around it, but I would actually list every symptom to make sure that you get them all. So I'm not entirely convinced. And emotion, yes, you've got to list the emotions because they're concrete and those have to be repeated back. But I'm not sure that my notes would be any shorter for PSI than they would be for what we were doing previously.
Absolutely, I agree. And I think that one of those early questions that I asked in that first series, you know, have you experienced nausea, vomiting, diarrhea and constipation? I think for those sorts of things, I'd probably be much more word-based to ensure precisely, yes, that I had that list. But where, you know, where I've got the lungs and being drained, I think some of those shortcuts can be helpful at those moments, but not necessarily as a blanket strategy.
And the other thing is, I've not come across the vast majority of professionals. I mean, doctors are certainly trained to ask questions in a certain way, and they do not allow people to speak for that long. And similarly, police, they wouldn't let somebody go on like that. They would be asking things. The only scenario that would be slightly more like that is the mental health interpreting I've done, where they might let somebody speak for longer to get the overall gist, but it's actually not that common. I would say. I'd say people tend to. It's the other professional that is keeping the interventions relatively short.
Yes. Yeah.
Can I kind of just chip in on Kasia said, because I agree partially, but I would say I disagree quite a bit, because what I found myself from 8 or so years in PSI is that professionals unfortunately adapt to practice, and very often it's bad practice because, and I'm not scared of using that word, bad practice, because a lot of interpreters would actually say, no, I don't do notes, I don't know how to take notes. And I think that's a huge error on our part, because you know, if you deal with and especially at the police stations as well, if you deal with a traumatized victim who wants to get it all out of themselves, you know, someone who's been, you know, raped, assaulted, they don't want to be necessarily interrupted every few seconds, every few sentences, even by a police officer. And the fact that, you know, the short consect seems to be the accepted mode is a testament to the fact that people just don't have the right skills to the job. And you know, I don't mean to, you know, sound pontificating, but I think that's the problem that we have, because I think in some contexts it has to be the long consect and it has to be the note taking. I mean, like Kasia said, for example, you know, maybe to, you know, in some situations you have to write the whole, you know, word, and you know, maybe kind of abbreviate it. Fair enough, but I think we should also have the same principles, you know, mastered. And I think PSI could learn a lot about from the conference mode, especially, you know, when you have a you know, someone who, like Kasia mentioned, is you know, perhaps experiencing a psychotic breakdown, and you have to be able to show, you know, the whole relationship between concept and, you know, people making stops and starts. But I think the fact that we only do short consect is the sign that, you know, perhaps it's not really the way it should be. Because personally, if I was, for example, assaulted, and it actually did happen to me once in my lifetime, that I was assaulted in Poland, funnily enough, and I had to make a statement at the police station, you know, and if I was a limited English speaker, I would be really annoyed and unhappy if someone just were going, oh no, stop, because I need to make notes. I mean, especially if it's, usually it's, you know, it's cases which are not perhaps extremely complex. You know, we're not explaining splitting of the atom, we are explaining someone's human experience, you know, something we can relate to. I think we all should be able, all PSIs should be able to have that skill to maybe go on for, you know, 3, maybe up to 5 minutes, and allow that person to have the voice. I mean, I'm not even mentioning you know, victims of trafficking, human trafficking, refugees, asylum seekers. So I don't really work in, you know, in those contexts. But I believe, I mean, Christine might agree with me that especially that's the context where you want to be able to, you know, have that full human narrative of an experience.
I agree. It's tricky because, well, there are different points, aren't there, in, I suppose, in the police process, where a slightly longer go at saying a story may be more accepted than in others. So an initial statement, as opposed then to a second interview where the police actually want to probe. So in this particular interview case, the officer was stopping after every moment. So they sat down here, which arm was being held, so to get all that precise level of detail in a second interview. So in that sense, there were a lot more interruptions. So I think it very much is context dependent. I do have some concern though, where interpreters are forcefully saying, you know, can you stop after every sentence and let me interpret? Because I think that imposes a structure which is very difficult for participants necessarily to adhere to. And sometimes they break off at a point which is not helpful for the interpreter because of the language switch and combination. So, you know, it can be more helpful to have a couple of sentences rather than just one. So there's a delicate balance, but I think sometimes, like you say, that comes back to the lack of broader training available to all interpreters working on the market to develop those skills. And I think there is something useful. I've certainly found it helpful to work on my longer consecutive to then adapt to the shorter consecutive in terms of symbol formation and thinking about how to pass the information between primary and secondary information over time and get that down without omitting too much detail. So my advice really from today is to carry on with the 2 if you can. Yes.
Oh, could I just go back to, you know, what Kasia was talking about in terms of precision, and here I'm going to obviously mention my sort of particular field, which is legal. It's you know, precision is absolutely vital where you've got a situation like this assault in the park, because the police will want to know the precise details of the assault, because they need to know which charge to bring. You know, is it going to constitute a common assault, actual bodily harm, GBH, wounding? It depends on the level of injury. So those details have to be absolutely spot on.
Absolutely, yes. Yes, I was saying in this particular case, there was a sort of initial narrative giving in a general sense, and then the witness was brought back in for a very specific and detailed stop and start, sort of, as say, which arm, where were you standing at this point, to get absolutely at that level of detail, so that narrative approach wouldn't be appropriate for that type of questioning. But yeah, absolutely, very, very important point. I'm very well aware that we've slightly overshot time today, and there's just one thing I'd like you all to do before we leave, please. Do stay in touch if you've got more questions and comments. Kate will, circulate my email address. That's fine. But one of the things that the NWTN have been doing recently is to forge their links with universities, and I've been very, very grateful to be given an honorary membership of NWTN for this year. So today's session is part of a reciprocation for that honour of being a member for this year. And so the decision's been taken to donate my fee to charity for today, but I'd like everybody to take a vote on which charity it will go to. So the NWTN colleagues have shortlisted 3, so I'm just going to put them on the screen very briefly, and Kate will set up a poll. Just very briefly, there are 3 charities. Here we go. So one is a Manchester-based charity called Back on Track that supports disadvantaged adults. Translators Without Borders, you may have heard of, and UK Med, that's focusing particularly at the moment on COVID-related emergencies. So take a moment to have a look at that there, and hopefully you can see on your screen now who you'd like to vote for. Okay, brilliant. So it looks like the result then is to donate to Manchester-based Back on Track, which I think is a fantastic choice. So thank you everybody for doing that. Kate, is there anything you would like to say before we close the session for today?
Yes, please, just to say thank you very, very much, Rebecca, for what I hope everyone else has found to be a very informative and useful session. Some of the comments have reflected the fact that people feel that they definitely need to practice some more. Practice makes perfect, but as you say, it doesn't need to be perfect. And just to reiterate that, the PowerPoint and your repository link will be shared with people that have attended via email. We've got the email addresses from the Eventbrite link, so you won't need to share them again, hopefully. And also we will put, for the NWTN members, we will put them onto the member resources section of the website so that you can go back to them at any time. I do need to ask a favour, as is customary with NWTN events, if I could have a volunteer please for someone to write a short blog article on the event today, just summarising how they found it, what they found useful, the key points that they're going to take away. So if I could have please a volunteer, that would be excellent. I don't really want to pick anybody. Stunned silence.
I can do it if you want.
Who said that? That didn't.
Oh,
brilliant.
Aggie.
Thank you. So I'll send you an email at the end so that just to briefly explain what we'd like from you, but nothing too complicated. That's excellent. Thank you very much indeed. And just to make you aware as well that I have recorded the session today, so that will also be available on via an email link, which will be attached to the email that you receive. So yes, thank you ever so much everybody for giving up your Saturday morning, and thank you again, Rebecca. Round of applause from everybody. There you go. And yeah, hope to see you all again soon. One final reminder to NWTN members, please, is if you haven't already, please do complete our events survey that we've sent to you via your emails recently, just so that we're clear on what sort of events we can put on for you in the next few months. Thank you, everybody. That will be it from us for today.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.